A man spent 11 years trying to force a river to flow uphill. Not literally. He spent 11 years pushing against a marriage that had already ended in every way except the paperwork. A business partner who had already decided to leave long before he said it out loud. A body that kept breaking down every time he tried to muscle through an injury instead of letting it heal. Every single year, he pushed harder. Every single year, the river pushed back exactly as hard, because rivers do not negotiate with men who refuse to read the terrain. He called it determination. He called it not giving up. He called it staying strong. What he was actually doing, for 11 straight years, was mistaking force for direction, confusing the amount of effort he was applying with whether the effort was even pointed somewhere worth going. He finally stopped, not because he became weaker, but because his body gave him no other option. A collapse. A diagnosis. A silence so complete it finally let him hear what the river had been telling him for over a decade. It was never going to flow uphill, no matter how hard he pushed, and every year he spent pushing was a year he didn't spend finding the actual direction the water wanted to go. This is not a story about a man. This is a story about you, right now, in whatever area of your life you've quietly decided that more force is the answer to a problem force was never going to solve. Because here is the part nobody on this kind of channel wants to admit, because it sounds less impressive than grind harder. Some of the strongest men alive are currently exhausting themselves pushing against doors that were never going to open, while the actual door, the one built for them, the one already unlocked, sits 10 feet to their left, completely ignored. Because walking through an open door doesn't feel like the kind of effort they've been taught to respect. You have been told your entire life that strength means force. Push harder. Grind longer. Never stop. Nobody told you that some of the most disciplined men in history became disciplined specifically by learning when to stop forcing and start listening to what was actually in front of them. Welcome to Inner Steel. If you're new here, you're about to learn the difference between effort that builds and effort that simply exhausts, a distinction that takes most men decades to figure out, if they figure it out at all. Stay until the end, because the 9 stories that follow will show you exactly how to tell the difference the next time you're standing in front of a door, deciding whether to push harder or finally stop and look for the handle. Let's begin. Before the first story, sit with this for a second, because it's the thread running underneath every single point that follows. Force and direction are not the same variable, even though almost everyone treats them as if they are. You can have maximum force and zero direction, and the result is a man who works himself into the ground and still ends up exactly where he started, wondering why effort that should have moved mountains didn't move anything at all. You can also have modest force pointed in exactly the right direction, and watch it outperform 10 times the effort aimed at the wrong target. Nobody hands you a manual that tells you which situation you're currently in. You have to learn to read it yourself. And the 9 men in this video all learned that lesson the same way, by forcing the wrong thing for long enough that the cost of continuing finally became impossible to ignore. There is a particular exhaustion that doesn't come from working hard. It comes from working hard in the wrong direction, for so long, that the exhaustion itself starts to feel like proof you're doing something right. This is the trap almost every driven man eventually falls into, because our culture has spent decades teaching him that tired equals virtuous, that struggle equals progress, that if it isn't hard, it doesn't count. Nobody teaches him the far more uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes the hardness is the evidence that he's doing it wrong, not proof that he's doing it right. Forcing feels like control. That's the trap inside the trap. When a man pushes against something that won't move, he gets to feel, in the moment, like he's the one steering his life, like he's the one in charge of the outcome. Stopping, listening, adjusting course, that feels, falsely, like surrender. Like giving up the wheel. But the men you're about to meet did not become legendary by gripping the wheel tighter than everyone else. They became legendary by knowing exactly when gripping had stopped being strength and started being denial. There's a reason this lesson resists being taught through advice alone, and has to be taught through story instead. Told directly, as a piece of advice, stop forcing things, learn to read the situation, adapt instead of pushing. It sounds soft, almost like permission to quit the moment something gets uncomfortable. That's precisely the misreading this entire video exists to correct. Every man in the next 9 stories pushed first, often for years, often with real discipline and real sacrifice, before he learned where pushing stopped being useful. None of them are examples of men who avoided hard work. They are examples of men who eventually figured out where hard work needed to be redirected, and the redirection itself required more discipline, not less, than simply continuing to push blindly in the original direction ever did. So if you're ready to stop confusing exhaustion with progress, here is where it starts. With a man who spent years trying to win a war the way everyone told him wars were supposed to be won, until he finally stopped forcing the wrong strategy and found the one that actually worked. George Washington spent the early years of the Revolutionary War trying to fight the British the way wars were conventionally supposed to be fought: large, organized battles, direct confrontation, armies meeting in open fields exactly as European military doctrine demanded. And he kept losing. Not occasionally. Repeatedly, badly, in ways that nearly ended the war and the country before either one had a real chance to exist. New York fell. Long Island was a disaster. His forces were undertrained, underfed, undersupplied, and consistently outmatched by the most professional military force on the planet at that time. By every conventional measure of how this kind of war was supposed to be won, Washington was forcing a strategy onto a situation that simply would not bend to it, no matter how much courage his men brought to the field. What changed the war was not Washington discovering a way to force the conventional strategy to finally work. It was Washington abandoning the strategy itself. He shifted toward what military historians now call a war of attrition and avoidance, refusing large, decisive confrontations whenever he could avoid them, preserving his army's survival over winning individual battles, picking moments of opportunity like the famous crossing of the Delaware to strike when the enemy least expected it, then retreating before a full engagement could destroy what he had left. He stopped trying to out-British the British at their own game. He started playing a different game entirely, one suited to the actual resources, terrain, and army he actually had, instead of the army a textbook said he should have had. This is the first brick of stopping the force. You cannot win by applying someone else's strategy to your situation simply because it's the strategy everyone respects. The man in your life chasing a goal by copying exactly how someone else achieved theirs, the same hours, the same method, the same approach, often ends up exhausted and confused as to why it isn't working, never considering that the strategy itself might be wrong for his actual terrain. Washington had to lose enough battles, badly enough, before he was willing to admit the textbook approach wasn't going to win this particular war. Most men need the same kind of repeated, undeniable losses before they'll consider that the problem might be the strategy, not the effort behind it. Look honestly at where you're currently forcing a strategy that keeps producing the same disappointing result no matter how much harder you push it. Maybe it's a sales approach that worked for someone else's business but keeps failing in yours. Maybe it's a workout program built for a body type that isn't your body type. Maybe it's a way of approaching relationships that keeps producing the same outcome regardless of who's on the other end of it. Washington is telling you something across 2.5 centuries. The issue was never your willingness to fight. It might be the war you've chosen to fight it in. There's a detail worth adding that most retellings leave out. Washington was not naturally inclined toward this kind of patient, attrition-based strategy. By multiple historical accounts, he found it frustrating and unsatisfying compared to the decisive battlefield victories he had originally hoped to win, the kind that would have matched the image he carried of what a successful general was supposed to look like. He adopted the strategy not because it felt good, but because the alternative kept failing in ways that were no longer survivable for the army or the cause. That distinction matters. Stopping the wrong force isn't always a moment of peaceful clarity. More often it's a grudging, uncomfortable admission, made because reality has simply made the alternative impossible to continue ignoring. If you've made it this far, subscribe to Inner Steel, because the next 8 stories will keep showing you exactly where men mistake force for direction, and once you start seeing the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere in your own life, which is the entire point of staying for the rest of this. There is a story about Thomas Edison that gets repeated so often it's lost almost all of its actual texture, reduced to a single inspirational quote about 10,000 failed attempts. The real story is more useful than the quote, because it's not actually a story about persistence alone. It's a story about a man who kept forcing the same basic approach to a filament material for years, failing in nearly identical ways, until he finally stopped forcing that specific material and opened the search to materials nobody on his team had seriously considered. For years, Edison's laboratory pursued metal filaments almost exclusively, because metal was the obvious, conventional choice for something that needed to handle heat and conduct electricity reliably. Every metal they tried either burned out too quickly or was too expensive to manufacture at scale. The team kept refining the same basic approach, adjusting thickness, adjusting metal composition, adjusting the vacuum inside the bulb, applying more effort and more precision to a category of material that was fundamentally limited in ways no amount of refinement was going to solve. The forcing wasn't laziness. It was relentless, well-funded, highly skilled effort, pointed at a door that simply did not have a handle on that side. The breakthrough came when Edison's team finally widened the search to carbonized organic materials, and eventually found that a carbonized cotton thread, and later a specific type of bamboo fiber, could glow reliably for hundreds of hours, vastly outperforming every metal filament they had spent years forcing into working. The solution wasn't more effort applied to the original approach. It was the willingness to admit the original approach, however much time and money had already been sunk into it, was the wrong category of solution entirely. This is your second brick. Sunk effort is not a reason to keep forcing a failing approach. It feels like one. Quitting after years of work feels like wasting those years, but the years are already spent either way. The only remaining question is whether you keep spending more years on the same approach that hasn't worked, or whether you finally admit the category itself might be wrong and look somewhere else. Edison's team did not waste their years on metal filaments. Those years taught them, with total clarity, exactly which door didn't have a handle, which made it far easier to recognize the door that did, the moment they finally looked elsewhere. Your years spent forcing the wrong approach are not wasted either, as long as you eventually let them teach you that, instead of letting them convince you to keep forcing the same door for another decade out of pure stubbornness. What made the eventual shift possible wasn't a single flash of insight arriving out of nowhere. It came from Edison's habit of testing an enormous range of materials almost systematically once the metal approach had exhausted itself, including, according to popular accounts, even testing a hair from a colleague's beard out of sheer willingness to rule things in or out rather than assume he already knew the answer. The lesson isn't romantic persistence alone. It's the specific discipline of staying curious about the actual category of solution even after you've abandoned your favorite candidate within that category, refusing to let frustration narrow your search exactly when it should be widening. Bruce Lee, a man whose entire public image was built on relentless physical discipline and hard training, is also responsible for one of the most quoted lines about the danger of force itself: be like water. People repeat that phrase today as a vague aesthetic, printed on posters next to the same bamboo and stone imagery used to sell things that have nothing to do with what he actually meant. What he meant was specific, practical, and came directly out of his own injuries. Lee suffered a serious back injury in 1970 that, by some accounts, doctors told him might end his ability to do martial arts at the level he had built his entire identity around. He had spent years training with maximum force, pushing his body harder, training longer, demanding more from muscles and joints that eventually answered back with an injury serious enough to threaten everything he'd built. During his recovery, forced into stillness for the first time in years, he spent extended time studying philosophy, particularly Taoist concepts of yielding and adaptability, and came to a conclusion that reshaped how he approached not just martial arts but the rest of his short life. Water, he observed, doesn't defeat an obstacle by overpowering it with raw force. It moves around what it cannot move through. It takes the shape of whatever container holds it. It is, paradoxically, one of the softest substances that exists, and also one of the only forces on Earth capable of eventually cutting through solid stone, given enough time. His martial arts philosophy afterward emphasized adaptability over rigid force, meeting an opponent's energy and redirecting it rather than simply trying to overpower it with greater strength. This wasn't a retreat from discipline or intensity. If anything, it required more discipline than brute force did, because forcing your way through a problem requires only effort. Adapting to a problem requires effort plus the humility to notice, in real time, exactly what the situation is actually asking for instead of what you've already decided to give it regardless of what's needed. This is your third brick. Adaptability is not the opposite of strength. It is a more advanced, more difficult form of it. The man who can only solve problems by applying more force is limited to solving the narrow category of problems that force actually works on. The man who can read a situation and adjust his approach to match it, sometimes with force, sometimes by yielding, sometimes by simply waiting, can solve a far wider range of problems, because he isn't carrying a single tool and trying to make every situation fit that one tool. Lee's back injury, the very thing that should have ended his career, became the forced pause that taught him the philosophy responsible for some of his most important work afterward. Notice where your own body or your own results are currently sending you the same signal, and consider, seriously, that the signal might not be telling you to push harder. Lee's own training method afterward, which he eventually called Jeet Kune Do, was deliberately built without the rigid forms and fixed sequences that traditional martial arts styles relied on, precisely because he had come to see those fixed forms as a kind of forcing, training the body to repeat a predetermined motion regardless of what an actual opponent's actual movement called for in that exact moment. He wanted students capable of responding to what was really in front of them rather than executing a memorized sequence regardless of fit. That's worth applying directly to your own life. Most men carry a small set of fixed responses they apply to every challenge regardless of whether the challenge actually calls for that particular response, and they call the resulting friction discipline, when it's often simply a refusal to develop more than one tool. Subscribe to Inner Steel if this is landing, because the next several stories go even deeper into exactly how to tell the difference between a problem that needs more force and a problem that needs you to finally stop and listen. And that distinction is going to matter more in your actual life than almost anything else on this channel. In the spring of 1925, a young writer named F. Scott Fitzgerald had already published 2 successful novels and had built, by his mid-20s, the kind of literary career most writers spend a lifetime chasing without ever reaching. He sat down to write what he intended to be his masterpiece, and the first version of what would eventually become The Great Gatsby did not work. He forced draft after draft of a structure that wasn't serving the story, pushing the narrative through a more conventional, chronological telling that flattened the very mystery and longing the book needed in order to land. His editor, Maxwell Perkins, recognized that the talent was undeniably there and that the forcing was the actual problem. Fitzgerald was trying to make the book do something it didn't want to do, structurally, and no amount of additional polish on that structure was going to fix what the structure itself couldn't support. The breakthrough came when Fitzgerald finally stopped forcing a straightforward retelling and restructured the entire novel around Nick Carraway as an outside narrator, watching Gatsby's story unfold rather than living inside it directly, creating exactly the distance, mystery, and unreliable wonder that made the book work in a way the earlier, more forced version never could. He didn't write harder. He wrote differently, after finally admitting the approach itself, not his effort, was the actual obstacle. This is your fourth brick. Sometimes the block in front of you isn't a wall that needs more force to break through. It's a sign reading wrong door, and pushing harder against the wrong door doesn't get you closer to the right one. It just convinces you, through sheer exhaustion, that no door exists. Fitzgerald had genuine talent and was applying it relentlessly. And none of that effort mattered until he was willing to ask whether the structure itself, not his skill, was the actual problem. Ask that question honestly about whatever you're currently forcing. It might be talent applied to the wrong shape entirely, waiting for you to notice the shape before the talent can finally do its job. It's worth noting that Fitzgerald did not arrive at the Nick Carraway structure quickly or easily once he stopped forcing the original approach. The correspondence between him and Perkins over those revisions shows a writer genuinely uncertain whether the new structure would even work, trying it not because he was confident it was right but because he had run out of confidence in what he'd already built. Letting go of a forced approach rarely feels like discovering the obvious right answer in the moment. It usually feels like stepping into uncertainty that's at least more honest than the certainty of continuing to fail at something familiar. Admiral William McRaven tells a story from Navy SEAL training that almost never gets included when people quote his more famous advice about making your bed every morning. During Hell Week, the most brutal stretch of SEAL training, trainees are pushed to a point of exhaustion specifically designed to find the edge of what a human body and mind can endure under sustained sleep deprivation, cold, and physical demand. The trainees who tend to quit are not, contrary to what most people assume, the ones with the weakest bodies. They are very often strong, capable men who approach the entire week by trying to force their way through every single evolution at maximum output from the first minute, treating the whole week as one continuous battle to be won through sheer will alone. The instructors watch for something more specific than raw toughness. They watch for men who can read the actual demand of each moment, knowing when an evolution genuinely requires everything they have, and knowing when conserving energy, working efficiently instead of maximally, listening to the rhythm of the exercise rather than fighting against it, is the smarter application of the same toughness. McRaven himself has described watching physically gifted men quit because they burned themselves out forcing maximum effort onto moments that didn't require it, while leaving nothing in reserve for the moments that genuinely did. This is your fifth brick. Total effort applied indiscriminately to every single moment is not the same thing as strength. It's a failure to read which moments actually require everything you have and which moments require you to simply endure efficiently, conserving what you'll need later. The man who treats every obstacle in his life, every conversation, every setback, every difficult conversation, every workout, with identical maximum force is going to burn out long before the moment that actually demands it arrives. Discernment about where to spend your force is itself a form of discipline, arguably a harder one than simply applying maximum effort everywhere, because it requires you to stay clear-headed enough, even under pressure, to tell the difference in real time. McRaven has also pointed out something easy to miss in the toughness narrative around Hell Week. The trainees who succeed are rarely operating entirely alone in their own head the whole time. They lean on small moments of connection with the men around them, brief jokes, shared glances, tiny exchanges that cost almost nothing in terms of energy but restore something that pure grit alone cannot supply. Forcing yourself through anything in complete isolation, refusing even small moments of relief or connection because they feel like distractions from the suffering, is its own version of misapplied force, burning resources on maintaining an image of toughness that doesn't actually help you finish the evolution in front of you. There's a specific exercise during Hell Week, often involving prolonged time in cold surf, where instructors deliberately watch for trainees who try to fight the cold through sheer muscular tension, clenching against it as if enough physical resistance could simply overpower the temperature of the water. Those trainees typically struggle longer and recover slower than the ones who learn, often through direct coaching in the moment, to relax into the cold instead of fighting it, controlling their breathing rather than their muscles, conserving the energy that fighting the sensation would have burned for nothing since the water's temperature was never going to change regardless of how hard anyone clenched against it. The same physical lesson, learned in freezing surf, applies almost exactly to whatever emotional or professional cold you're currently trying to muscle through with tension alone instead of breath and patience. There's a particular kind of injury that happens almost exclusively to men who refuse to stop forcing their bodies past a signal that was asking, clearly, to be heard. The kettlebell world has a well-documented history of this, but perhaps no story illustrates it more plainly than the experience shared widely among strength athletes about training through pain that the body had already flagged repeatedly as a warning rather than simple discomfort. Pavel Tsatsouline, one of the most influential strength coaches of the past several decades, built much of his later teaching around a principle that runs directly against the bro science instinct to always push through, the difference between productive discomfort, which builds you, and actual pain signaling damage, which a man ignores at the cost of months or years of recovery he didn't need to lose. He has described, in various interviews and writings, watching strong, motivated trainees force their way through clear pain signals because they had absorbed a culture that treats stopping as weakness regardless of what the signal actually means, only to end up sidelined for months with an injury that simple listening, weeks earlier, would have prevented entirely. The strongest athletes he's coached, by his own account, are not the ones who never stop. They're the ones disciplined enough to stop at exactly the right moment, despite the discomfort that stopping itself can cause to a man's ego. This is your sixth brick, and it applies far beyond the gym. Pain is data, not a moral test. The instinct to treat every signal your body or your life sends you as something to be overpowered through sheer will is not strength. It's a refusal to listen that eventually gets billed back to you with interest, usually at the worst possible time, in the form of an injury, a burnout, or a collapse you could have avoided by simply respecting the signal the first time it arrived instead of the fifth. Tsatsouline draws a distinction worth keeping in mind day to day, separate from the injury itself. The discomfort of genuine effort under load almost always feels diffuse, generalized, the kind of fatigue that spreads evenly across a muscle or across a difficult task. Real warning pain tends to feel sharp, localized, specific, often in a joint rather than a muscle. Most men who get hurt forcing through a bad signal already sensed, somewhere underneath their determination, that this particular sensation was different from ordinary effort. They pushed anyway because stopping felt, in that exact moment, like admitting weakness in front of themselves, which is a strange kind of audience to perform toughness for, considering it's the only audience that actually pays the price afterward. This same distinction extends well past physical training into nearly every domain a man operates in. The discomfort of a hard conversation that needs to happen, the fatigue of a difficult project that's genuinely worth finishing, the soreness of a habit you're still building that hasn't become easy yet, all of that is the diffuse, productive kind of difficulty, the kind that builds you the longer you stay with it. But there's a separate category, sharper and more specific, that shows up as a particular relationship that consistently leaves you smaller every time you engage with it, a particular project that keeps producing diminishing returns no matter how much more time you pour into it, a particular pattern in your own behavior that keeps generating the same painful result every time you repeat it. Learning to tell these two categories apart, in real time, without years of hindsight to clarify it for you afterward, is exactly the skill every story in this video has been circling, told through gyms and battlefields and laboratories and basketball courts, because the underlying skill is the same one no matter which field it shows up in. If you're still here, subscribe to Inner Steel, because the next three stories are the ones that tie everything together into something you can actually use the next time you're standing in front of a closed door deciding whether to push harder or finally stop and read it properly. Notice something before the next story begins, because it's easy to miss if you're only listening for the historical names. Every example so far has involved a man hitting a wall hard enough, and often publicly enough, that the cost of his forcing became undeniable even to himself. Washington lost cities. Edison's team burned through years and a great deal of funding. Bruce Lee nearly lost his career. Fitzgerald nearly buried what would become his best work inside a structure that didn't serve it. The pattern that follows from here continues that same theme, but starts shifting towards something slightly different. Situations where the forcing wasn't failing loudly enough to demand attention, where it was technically working well enough that stopping required a different, quieter kind of courage than simply admitting defeat. In 1962, a company called Decca Records famously rejected a young band from Liverpool after an audition, reportedly telling their manager that guitar groups were on their way out. The band was the Beatles, and the story usually gets told as a simple lesson about rejection not meaning failure, which is true but incomplete. The more useful part of the story is what the band did in the years immediately following that rejection, because it wasn't simply try harder at the same thing. It was a series of deliberate shifts in direction, sound, and approach, repeated multiple times over the following years, refusing to force a single static identity onto a band that kept discovering new things were possible. Their early sound, heavily influenced by American rock and roll and skiffle, was not forced to remain static once they realized other sounds were calling to them. They absorbed influences from Motown, from Bob Dylan's lyrical approach, eventually from Indian classical music and from experimental studio techniques that had nothing to do with where they started. Each shift required the band, and particularly the songwriting partnership at its center, to abandon an approach that was already working commercially, in favor of a direction that felt more true to where their actual creative energy was pulling them. Forcing themselves to keep replicating the early formula, the safe and proven one, would have kept the band successful by any conventional commercial measure for years. It also would have prevented nearly everything that made their later work as enduring as it became. This is your seventh brick. Sometimes the thing you need to stop forcing isn't a strategy that's failing. It's a strategy that's succeeding, but has stopped being where your actual growth wants to go. Men get trapped here more often than the failure version of this lesson, because success is much harder to walk away from than failure is. Nobody questions you for abandoning something that clearly isn't working. People question you constantly for abandoning something that clearly is working, even when some quieter part of you already knows it's not where you're actually supposed to keep building. Listen to that quieter part before the success itself becomes the cage forcing you to stay somewhere you've already outgrown. It's worth noting that each of these shifts cost the band something real in the moment, not just creative risk but actual fan reaction, with portions of their existing audience confused or unhappy each time the sound moved somewhere new. There was no guarantee, at any single one of these transitions, that the new direction would land as well commercially as the one being abandoned. They made the shift anyway, repeatedly, because forcing themselves to keep manufacturing the earlier sound on demand had started to feel, by their own later accounts, like a kind of dishonesty toward where they had actually grown to as people and as musicians. Outgrowing a strategy that still technically works is one of the quietest, least celebrated forms of courage available to a man, precisely because nobody around you is going to applaud you for walking away from something that was still paying the bills. There's a particular kind of stubbornness that almost ended the career of a basketball player most people now consider among the greatest who ever played the game, and it had nothing to do with talent or work ethic, both of which Michael Jordan had in obvious, well-documented abundance from a young age. It had to do with his early insistence on forcing a primarily individual, isolation-heavy style of play onto a team game that, by its nature, required a different kind of force entirely, distributed, shared, dependent on trusting teammates with the ball in moments where his own instinct screamed to take over personally. For years, Jordan's Chicago Bulls teams were extraordinarily talented and consistently fell short in the playoffs against teams that played a more cohesive, team-oriented style. Jordan's individual brilliance, forced onto every possession regardless of what the specific defense or moment actually called for, was not enough on its own to win the championships everyone, including Jordan himself, expected. The turning point came under coach Phil Jackson's introduction of the triangle offense, a system explicitly designed to distribute force across the entire team rather than concentrating it permanently in one player, no matter how capable that player was. Jordan initially resisted it, by his own later admission, because trusting the system meant occasionally not forcing his own will onto a possession where his individual talent might genuinely have produced a better immediate result, in service of a structure that produced better results across an entire season and across an entire team. Once he genuinely committed to the system rather than merely tolerating it, the championships followed, not because Jordan became less dominant individually, but because he finally stopped forcing every situation to bend around his personal force alone, and started trusting a structure that knew when to redirect that force through other players instead. The greatest individual talent of his generation had to learn, the hard way, across several painful playoff losses, that some kinds of winning required the discipline to stop forcing your own strength onto every single moment. This is your eighth brick. Even extraordinary individual capability has a ceiling the moment it refuses to operate inside a structure larger than itself. The man who insists on personally forcing every outcome in his business, his family, his team, his life, refusing to delegate, refusing to trust a system or another person with anything that matters, is not demonstrating strength. He's demonstrating a ceiling he's installed on himself, built directly out of his unwillingness to let force be distributed instead of concentrated entirely in his own two hands. Jordan needed 4 other players on the floor who trusted the system as much as he eventually learned to. Look honestly at where you're currently the bottleneck in your own life simply because you refuse to stop forcing yourself to be the only source of effort in a situation that was never built to run on one man's force alone. What made Jordan's eventual transformation more than just tactical compliance was the internal shift underneath it. By multiple accounts from teammates and coaches at the time, He had to genuinely let go of the belief that trusting a teammate in a critical moment was a risk to his own legacy, rather than simply a different, equally valid path to the same outcome he wanted. That belief, more than the X's and O's of any specific offensive system, was the actual force he had been applying for years, and it was the actual force he eventually had to release. The system was always available to him. What wasn't available, until he changed internally, was the willingness to use it. It's worth remembering that this shift did not happen in a single off-season or through a single conversation with his coach. It took years, several painful playoff exits, and by his own later reflection, a fair amount of ego that had to be examined and set down piece by piece rather than all at once. Men looking for a quick turning point in their own life, expecting the realization to arrive in one clean insight that immediately resolves years of forcing the wrong approach, are often setting themselves up for disappointment when the actual process turns out to be slower and less dramatic than that. Jordan's transformation looked sudden from the outside, the way most transformations do once the championships start arriving. From the inside, by every account from the people who were actually there for it, it was gradual, uneven, and required him to keep choosing the system again and again in smaller moments long before the larger payoff ever became visible to anyone watching. Lao Tzu, the figure traditionally credited as the founder of Taoist philosophy, is said to have spent much of his life as a court archivist before eventually withdrawing from public life entirely, leaving behind a short text called the Tao Te Ching that has shaped Eastern philosophy for over 2,000 years. Almost everything in that text circles back, in different language and different metaphor, to a single repeated idea that runs directly counter to how most ambitious men instinctively try to live. The softest things in the world overcome the hardest things in the world, and the sage accomplishes great things by doing very little forcing at all, allowing things to unfold according to their own nature rather than constantly imposing his will onto them. This idea, called Wu Wei, often gets mistranslated into modern self-help language as simply, "go with the flow," which strips it of the actual discipline it requires. Wu Wei does not mean passivity or laziness. It means action so well aligned with the actual nature of a situation that it requires no forcing to produce results. The way water doesn't strain to flow downhill, the way a skilled carpenter doesn't fight the grain of the wood but works with it, producing a stronger result with less wasted effort than a less skilled carpenter forcing his tool against the grain out of impatience or ignorance. The discipline required to practice this is, paradoxically, often greater than the discipline required to simply force your way through everything, because forcing requires only stubbornness. Working in alignment with the actual nature of a situation requires patience, observation, humility about what you don't yet understand about the terrain you're standing in, and the willingness to adjust your approach continuously based on what the situation is actually showing you, rather than what you've already decided it should be regardless of evidence. A man who has never practiced this finds it almost unbearably uncomfortable at first, because it requires releasing the illusion of total control that forcing provides, in exchange for a kind of control that's real but far less visible, far less immediately satisfying to the ego. There's a passage often attributed to this same tradition describing a butcher whose knife had remained perfectly sharp after 19 years of use, while ordinary butchers wore their blades down to nothing within months. When asked how, the butcher explained that he no longer hacked through the meat by force. He had spent years learning the actual structure of the joints, the natural spaces already present in the body in front of him, and his blades simply moved through those spaces rather than fighting against bone and tendon that weren't meant to be cut through directly. 19 years of work had produced not more strength in his arm, but more precision in his attention, the ability to see, before the knife ever moved, exactly where the actual opening already existed. That is the version of strength this entire video has been circling around from the first story to this one, not the ability to apply more force, but the developed eye that knows, increasingly, where force barely needs to be applied at all because the opening was already there, waiting to be noticed instead of forced into existence. This is also where the idea connects back to something every single one of the 8 men before Lao Tzu eventually discovered independently, in completely different centuries and completely different fields. Alignment with reality is not a passive state you fall into by accident. It is an active skill, sharpened the same way any other skill is sharpened, through repeated attention and repeated willingness to be wrong about where you thought the opening was. The butcher's first few years with that knife were almost certainly clumsy, full of moments where he still hacked and forced and dulled the blade unnecessarily, before 19 years of attention taught him to see what had been there from the beginning. You are not going to develop this kind of precision by reading about it once. You develop it the same way the butcher did, by paying closer attention than you currently do, every single time you notice yourself forcing something, to whether an easier opening might already be sitting right next to the resistance you're currently fighting. This is your 9th and final brick. The goal was never to stop applying effort. The goal is to stop applying effort blindly, in every direction, regardless of what the situation is actually asking for, and start applying it precisely, where it actually produces movement instead of just heat and exhaustion. Washington stopped forcing the wrong war strategy and found the one suited to his actual army. Edison's team stopped forcing metal filaments and found the material that actually worked. Bruce Lee stopped forcing rigid martial force and found the adaptability that made him legendary. Fitzgerald stopped forcing the wrong narrative structure and found the one that made Gatsby endure for a century. The SEAL trainees who finished Hell Week stopped forcing maximum output onto every moment and learned to read which moments actually demanded it. The strength athletes who avoided unnecessary injury learned to read pain as information instead of a test of manhood to be overpowered regardless of cost. The Beatles stopped forcing their early sound to remain static and let their actual creative direction lead them somewhere larger. Jordan stopped forcing every possession through his own individual will alone and let a system distribute that force across an entire team. And Lao Tzu, 2,500 years before any of them, already understood that the softest, most patient force, properly aligned with the nature of the actual situation, outlasts and outperforms the hardest force applied blindly against it. What's easy to miss, hearing all 9 of these back to back, is that not one of these men became less driven, less disciplined, or less serious about his craft the moment he stopped forcing the wrong approach. If anything, the opposite happened in every single case. Washington's later campaigns required more patience and more sustained attention than the simpler, more aggressive strategy he'd abandoned. Edison's widened search demanded more curiosity and more sustained testing than narrowing in on a single material ever had. Jordan's commitment to trusting a system required him to manage his own ego more carefully than simply imposing his will on every possession ever had. Stopping the wrong force was never the easy option in any of these stories. It was simply the option that finally pointed an already considerable amount of discipline in a direction where it could actually produce something lasting, instead of just producing more proof of how hard the man was willing to work regardless of whether the work was going anywhere. Go back now to the man at the very beginning of this, the one who spent 11 years trying to force a river to flow uphill. He was not lacking in strength. By any conventional measure, he had more determination, more grit, more raw willpower than most men will ever need to call upon in their entire lives. What he lacked was the willingness to stop, even once, long enough to ask whether the direction he was pushing in was actually the direction that led anywhere. Strength misapplied for 11 years is not strength. It's exhaustion wearing strength's clothing, convincing everyone watching, including the man himself, that something productive is happening simply because effort is visibly, undeniably present. You likely have your own river right now. A relationship you keep trying to force back into a shape it no longer fits. A career path you keep pushing harder into, even as every signal around you suggests the effort isn't producing growth, only fatigue. A version of yourself you keep trying to force into existence through sheer willpower alone, without ever stopping to ask whether the approach itself, not your commitment, is the actual obstacle standing in your way. None of the men in this video are telling you to stop trying. They're telling you something more specific and considerably more useful. Stop trying the same way, in the same direction, against the same wall, simply because stopping to look around feels, falsely, like giving up. Notice the pattern sitting underneath every single story you just heard, because it's the same pattern every time, dressed in different historical clothing. Washington had to lose battles before he could see the better strategy. Edison's team had to exhaust an entire category of materials before they widened their search. Bruce Lee had to suffer an injury serious enough to threaten his entire career before he was willing to question force itself as a philosophy. Fitzgerald had to fail at the obvious structure before he found the one that worked. The SEAL trainees who succeeded had to fail at maximum effort everywhere before learning discernment. The strength athletes who avoided injury usually learned the distinction the hard way at least once, through an earlier injury they didn't avoid. The Beatles had to outgrow a sound that was still working before the work that mattered most could happen. Jordan had to lose enough playoff series, painfully, publicly, before he was willing to trust the system over his own individual will. None of these men arrived at wisdom through calm reflection alone. They arrived there because reality made the cost of continuing to force the wrong thing too expensive to keep paying. That is, frankly, how most men learn this lesson. Not through foresight. Through enough repeated, undeniable cost that the alternative finally becomes thinkable. There's a reason this video opened with a man freezing on a mountain rather than simply listing 9 names and their accomplishments. Wisdom borrowed from someone else's story only works if you let it actually touch the specific situation you're standing in right now, today, not as a pleasant idea to agree with, and then set back down the moment the video ends. Every man described here had access to the exact same insight you now have access to, and most of them only found it after years of unnecessary cost that a clear-eyed friend, or a story like this one, might have shortened considerably if they'd been willing to actually apply it instead of simply admiring it. Don't let this be information you found interesting. Let it be the thing that makes you stop, this week, in front of whatever wall you've been quietly bleeding energy against, and ask the one question that every single person in this video eventually had to ask, usually far later than they wished they had. You do not have to wait for 11 years like the man at the start of this, or for a serious injury like Bruce Lee, or for repeated playoff losses like Jordan, before you're willing to ask the question early. The entire purpose of hearing these stories now, today, rather than discovering them the hard way through your own decade of forcing the wrong thing, is so that you can shorten that timeline. You can ask the question this week, about whatever you're currently pushing against with everything you have, producing heat but very little actual movement. Is this a wall, or is this a door I haven't found the handle on yet? Is this effort that's building something, or effort that's simply proving to myself and everyone watching that I haven't given up, regardless of whether giving up this particular approach is exactly what the situation is quietly asking me to do? The strongest thing you can do this week might not be 1 more hour of forcing. It might be 1 hour of finally sitting still long enough to notice where the actual door is, the one that's already open, the one you've been walking past every single day because you were too busy pushing against the wall right next to it. Subscribe to Inner Steel, because learning to tell the difference between force that builds and force that simply exhausts you is not a lesson you learn once and finish. It's a discipline you have to keep relearning, in new situations, for the rest of your life, and you're going to need reminders like this one more than once before it finally becomes instinct instead of effort. Stop forcing it. Start reading it. Then move, precisely, not blindly, and watch how much further the same amount of strength actually takes you. Now go build, the smart way this time.